Hello and welcome to episode 282 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeds. Damien, how are you doing?
I'm good. It's been another great week at Money to the Masses Towers. We've got a lot done, and I also discovered that I can unlock Justin's phone with my Face ID. So Apple phones have Face ID. Apparently, twins occasionally can unlock each other's phones, and we've just discovered, despite the fact that we're often told by people, well, they dispute the fact we're identical twins. Look at our social media. I posted a picture this week and you can see Justin and me side by side, and beard and no beard. We still unlocked each other's phones. But this does add on to the story from, I think it was last year, where Justin and I accidentally walked through the airport scanners with each other's passports, not realising the face recognition there, and we managed to get through. That was in Portugal a couple of years ago, accidentally. So we must look at a base level to the computers more alike than other humans do. But I just thought that was a highlight of my week, actually, because it just showed I could go into Justin's bank if I was so inclined and empty his accounts of money if he had any, or if I was actually a fraudster.
It's amazing stuff. I mean, it's strange that these things don't have some sort of security in place, because you and Justin side by side, you've got quite a thick beard, Justin's got a bit of stubble. I mean, from one to the other, surely these things can go, well, that wasn't the guy I saw a minute ago. He's got a beard now. But, I mean, obviously, you broke the system.
We broke the system. I'm convinced we could do the voice recognition as well. So one time I'll have to try that. Maybe we are the exception that proves the rule. I don't know. Anyway, getting on with the podcast. Thank you to those people who left reviews. We had a number of really good reviews that we're going to read out probably next week. So do keep adding your reviews. They make our day when we read them. So we check the Apple iTunes to see if there are any reviews so we can read them. So they are great. They're very motivating for us. So please do keep adding them. Just going back onto last week, before I tell you what's on this week's show, it was quite interesting to see that this week, the last of the high street banks cut their instant access saving rates to 0.01%, basically nothing. And I was talking about the National Savings and Investments last week and about how they were providing the best rates for instant access savings accounts. So it's quite timely because it preempted the rest of us getting basically nothing on our savings. And I also spoke about emergency funds. And I just wanted to quickly mention something before we move on. It's been quite interesting to see how the pandemic has changed some of the conventional wisdoms around financial planning. And with the emergency fund, I've started to see some people, financial planners, talk about, rather than 3 to 6 months earnings or salary, start to talk about 24 months of pandemic spending. So what you were spending when we all cut back during the worst of the coronavirus pandemic. So between March and April, when we were all in lockdown, basing your emergency fund on 24 months of that. I'm assuming based on the idea that you may be locked down for an extended period of time and you were able to survive that period, and if you lose your job, etc. Just quite an interesting take on an old concept, and there will be a number of other parts of financial planning that will morph now because of the pandemic. Maybe it'll be a future piece for the podcast, but for this week's podcast, I'll tell you the 3 pieces, Andy. We're going to do a piece on overdrafts. So we've not talked about overdrafts, I think, ever, and they're particularly relevant now because of the rates have gone up incredibly high, up to 40% on an overdraft at the moment being charged by banks. And I want to do a piece around that, and also how people can get rid of their overdrafts, because more and more people are living in their overdrafts, partly because of the pandemic. I'm also going to do a piece on holidays. So many people are thinking about maybe going on holiday, particularly abroad. And I just wanted to talk about the rights that you have, because many people are thinking, should they book a holiday abroad? I'm going to just give you the reality of the situation and some advice. And then we're going to finish on a piece to do with scams, which Andy's about to explain. So we're going to have a rest from investing this week, because I thought we'd done a lot in the last couple of weeks. I thought we'd have a bit of a rest this week and go back onto investing next week. But one thing just to add, it's been an interesting week. If you've listened to Midweek Markets, then this week I talked a lot about the technology companies and their earnings, and we had really good earnings results from them on Thursday when they announced, and that been particularly boyish for the market. But it's just quite nice, if you are interested in investing, do listen to the Midweek Markets show, because they make sense of a lot of what's going on. And another thing at the moment, gold, as I'm looking at the screens now, is looking like it could touch $2,000 an ounce. It's been a very interesting topic in our group, actually, the Money to the Masses Facebook group. People are talking about gold a lot. And I actually hold some in my own investment portfolio. But anyway, Andy, the final piece is going to be on.
So I'm going to quickly cover off 10 of the biggest scams that have been around since coronavirus hit. And this is some research that's been done by some of the biggest banks. So just a quick couple of FYIs to make sure you don't get hit by one of these nasty scams. Right, we're going to start with overdrafts. Now, overdrafts for me were always, as I saw it, a really cheap, easy way of borrowing. But there's been a lot of changes, hasn't there? And they're not cheap anymore.
Do you know what, Andy? They never were. And that was the part of the problem. Is people thought they were cheaper than they actually are because the charging structures are really opaque. They're hard to understand. You remember you would get charged maybe £1 a day, £5 a day or something like that. There'd be all these charges, but when you actually add those up and try and work out what the rate of interest would be on an overdraft, particularly an unauthorized overdraft, it would be nearer 80% per annum. So that would be the rate you're being charged. That's according to the FCA when they were doing some research. Now, I remember, like many people, I've in the past lived in my overdraft. I get paid 1 month and I would bounce out into positive. And as the month went by, I would very quickly start to get into negative territory. And I'd get to that point in the month, probably fairly early on, where I'd be back into a negative balance and then you start to accrue charges. And with the pandemic, there are more and more people who are finding themselves using overdrafts, whether they be authorized ones, so where they've been previously agreed with the bank, or unauthorized, where they've just ended up going into an overdraft that wasn't previously agreed with a bank. Now, to explain the scenario, what's happened, you've probably seen headlines talking about 40% interest rates on overdrafts being charged by banks. And to explain the scenario, previously, as Andy said, there were charges that made it seem probably affordable, but actually overdrafts have been an expensive way to borrow money. And in June last year, June 2019, the FCA decided they were going to ban the per day, per month charging structures. They wanted to make banks charge an interest rate. So they would charge an interest rate that would be the same for authorized and unauthorized overdrafts. And the aim was to make comparison more easy and to increase competition, because obviously the idea being that if the rates are out there, it would somehow encourage other banks to be competitive.
Now, I suppose their thinking would be, well, if we can try and equalise the cost, then hopefully they'll come more near the charges of what the authorised overdrafts were. But I imagine a lot of the banks have gone the other way. And
well, that's exactly what's happened, Andy. You're bang on. And
because unauthorised overdrafts are really, really expensive compared to authorised.
Well, the FCA found they were 10 to 20 times more expensive than even taking out a payday loan.
Wow.
And that's mind-boggling. And so they wanted to try and bring it down into a more competitive arena and it be more clear what people were being charged. Of course, what actually happened, the banks just thought, well, do you know what? We've got this almost cartel. We've got this, is it an oligopoly? When there's many of them, basically what they decided is as a group to start to charge the same, and rates went up towards 40% per annum. That is the EAR rate, typically 39.9% being charged by most banks. That's what we found going into this year, because the rule change was going to occur in April this year, where banks had to go on to this new set of rules by charging this interest rate. Now, in January 2020, people started to look at this and go, hold on, what's going on here? This change, you haven't introduced a price cap. Without a price cap, it meant that the banks pushed up their rates. They didn't want to lose their profits. They pushed up the rates they were charging people. So suddenly it felt like for more people, overdrafts were becoming incredibly expensive and more expensive. Now, the FCA wrote to all the banks and asked them to explain their charges, how they all suddenly arrived at this almost 40% interest rate on overdrafts. And at the time, the FCA did say that they still believed 7 out of 10 people would be better off under the new rules than the old rules. So that just shows you how expensive the old charging structures were. Then coronavirus came along and that kind of messed everything up. If you recall, during the pandemic, there were support schemes that were put in place. So there would be these free £500 overdrafts that people who were struggling could access, and that was a support scheme. But what a lot of banks did is they actually just gave it to everybody automatically. So suddenly you will have seen letters in the post you would have got saying that you've got this £500 overdraft where you won't be charged. And that was to try and keep the country moving. During that period as well, the FCA put in like a temporary rule, which basically said, okay, under the new rules that are coming in April, we don't want anybody being worse off than under the old rules. And so that kept a lot of the campaigners happy that, okay, maybe things will actually work out, despite the fact there's no price cap. In July this year, the FCA decided that the new pricing was actually okay when they looked at what the banks had said about their new pricing models, despite the fact that there were companies like HSBC who did previously charge an interest rate on their overdraft. So in that way, they were different to other people, but it was 17.9% and they jumped theirs to 39.9%. The FCA looked at all this and said, yeah, it's fine. We're quite happy how this has turned out. But the rule was also tweaked in terms of the support. The £500 overdraft that we all seem to get, the rules were changed so that the people who were guaranteed not to be worse off would be the people who were struggling because of the coronavirus that's impacted their finances. What this means, in a roundabout way, we've come out the other side of this. Now, while that £500 overdraft scheme for those who are struggling was extended to October the 31st, for those people not struggling financially because of the effects of the coronavirus, if they'd used that overdraft that they previously got, that £500, they dipped into it, they could find themselves now being charged on that overdraft unless they contact their bank and explain their financial circumstances mean that they are struggling. Because the banks, suddenly, there were 10 major banks in the last couple of weeks have now upped their rate to nearly 40% on their standard overdraft charges. So we are in an environment where the rules changed from June last year, and we're at a point now in July where we are all looking at, realistically, 40% interest on overdrafts. And it's another example where the regulators introduced a rule. It's got a nice idea, a nice vision, but when they actually come to implement it, it ends up being a bit of a car crash. So the reason we're doing it on the podcast is because I don't think most people realise we're in a world where overdrafts now are very expensive. The FCA still claims it's cheaper now than it was. Okay, that's a positive. It is cheaper now for some people, or it's meant to be for most people, than it was back a year or so ago. But a 40% interest rate, think about that. If you had £1,000 overdraft, you could conceivably be charged by a bank about £400 in a year to have that overdraft. So it means now that it's even more clear that overdrafts are an expensive form of debt, and people want to try to get out of that cycle of being in debt from month to month and using their overdrafts I did when I was younger. And so to finish this piece off, what I want to do is give people a couple of tips. I mean, of course, there's the main idea that you should start budgeting. So you need to start budgeting. Yes, you might use some of the apps out there that help you do it. Yolt, some of the app-only banks like Starling will help you manage your spending. So you could try and pay back a fixed amount a month. That's what you need to do. You need to try and pay back a fixed amount a month because it is a debt. The thing with overdraft debt, because you whiz in and out of it, you get this false sense that you clear it at some point, but you never really are because you're always going back into it. So you need to start to budget and pay a set amount back. One tip that I never did, and it takes a bit of self-control, but it will reduce your charges, is if you shift your direct debits that you have on your account, because you want to have direct debits to pay your bills. But if you get paid and happens to me, I take all my direct debits out the day after I get paid because I like to make sure everything's been paid. Of course, if you're living in an environment where you're going into your overdraft each month, then that will probably immediately almost put you back towards your overdraft again if your direct debits for all your bills come out the day after payday. So instead, if you change your direct debits to be the day before payday, what it would mean is you're probably going to end up spending more of your month in positive before you crash into negative once all your direct debits get taken out. Now that takes a bit of control because you've got to make sure you manage your spending. You've got some money there that's going to pay those bills because you don't want to default on those bills. But if you think about it, it means that you end up spending far less time in your overdraft, which will actually reduce your charges and therefore increase your ability to repay it and get out of it. Another thing to do is ponder using a money transfer credit card. So they are credit cards that allow you to move a cash balance to pay into an account. So you could move that to clear your overdraft debt and therefore put it onto a cheaper credit card. And so you can see by shuffling your debt around, you can actually get a deal where you can have a 0% interest being charged on that debt that you were previously getting charged 40%, and therefore you'll be able to repay it quicker. And of course, if you are struggling with debt, then go and seek the advice of a charity like Step Change, and they give free advice online. So once you finish this podcast, make sure you know what you're getting charged on an overdraft when or if you were to use it by your bank. Oh, before I go on to the next one, another tip is to use an account for your spending that doesn't have an overdraft. So basically you run out of money and you can't spend into an overdraft and increase that debt that you've got. So that would be a separate account that you might move your money out for spending into that account, away from the overdraft that you've already got, and limit your spending if you struggle with controlling it.
Okay, moving on to holidays. People are starting to book up holidays again now, and we're going to be looking at holiday rights.
Yeah, this came about because of the news flow, really. There's been a lot going on with the coronavirus and holiday returns and refunds, and we've not covered it on the podcast. We've not covered your rights when it comes to getting a refund. We did a bit early on in the coronavirus pandemic where we talked about travel and everything like that, but we haven't really reviewed it since then because things have changed. I don't want to date the podcast. I'm not going to talk about individual countries like we've had Spain that was put on the naughty list effectively, and now people are going to have to quarantine when they travel back, because this is so fluid that by the time this podcast is launched on Sunday, and it's Friday now, who knows how the situation will change. So what I want to do is talk about the general rules and what's happening and where the travel industry is at the moment. And if you listen to midweek markets, you'll have noticed that the pound has gone up to $1.30. So we've seen the pound strengthen against a few other currencies, and so it might make people feel that traveling and going on holiday is something they want to do. It's actually becoming maybe a little bit more cost effective in some ways. And of course, we've all been stuck in lockdown, so the idea of going on holiday does appeal. But what we've seen is the issues from the pandemic when all the holidays were cancelled. You'd think there would be a case of once bitten, twice shy when it comes to going on holiday and refunds, because at the moment we are still seeing travel companies not issuing refunds as they are legally obliged to. And you think that would put some people off of going on holiday, but it doesn't seem to be. We're obviously still having these stories. As soon as the quarantine measures came in the other day, we had people on the news were talking about their holidays, etc., which is obviously disappointing for them. But the rights that they have to bear in mind is that if you book a holiday and it's a package holiday and it is cancelled, then you do have a right to a refund within 14 days. So you can insist on that. And you can't be made to have some sort of voucher or to have to defer your holiday or anything like that. You can insist on receiving a refund. Now, it's interesting. It's slightly different with airlines if you book directly with an airline, but I'll come on to that. But what was interesting is the Civil Aviation Authority did a piece of work, a bit of research, looking at how the airlines had fared during the worst part of the pandemic earlier this year when it came to issuing refunds. And of course, their conclusion was pretty much, when you look at it, it's pretty dismally. But there were three airlines, American Airlines, Jet2 and United Airlines, that had fared well in actually issuing the refunds to people, which is obviously kudos to them. But then on the one hand, you hear that, but then you also hear stories of how Jet2 are now asking people to come back from holidays early, particularly in Spain, as we make this podcast, because they're having to fly half-empty planes out to these destinations to get people back, because obviously there's less people traveling. So that's not cost-effective for them, so they don't want to do that. So they're saying that people got to come back earlier. So if you're booking a holiday, you've got to bear in mind that you're going to have some of these slightly obscure things that have never happened before, potentially airlines saying you've got to come home early, or things like the rules being changed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that suddenly says that a particular country is now on the list of countries that you've got to quarantine when you come home, or they advise against non-essential travel. Now, interestingly, there was a positive change because we had people wanting refunds and they weren't receiving them. And people who'd booked package holidays have now been offered a refund credit note. So you see it abbreviated to an RCN, which is effectively a note that allows them to rebook their holiday at a later date, and it gives them a right to a cash refund. But crucially, it is financially protected. So it's protected in the same way as their holiday was. And the government has ensured that any refund credit notes that were issued between the 10th of March this year and the 30th of September this year will be protected until the 30th of September 2021. So that should give people some reassurance that if they accept one of these notes, then it effectively is a refund of sorts. They can still request their refund, because the problem was people who were accepting vouchers were opening themselves to some form of financial loss. And the vouchers are in particularly in relation to the airlines that I'm referring to, because the thing you have to bear in mind, if you have an airline, so you book an airline flight on its own and you get given a voucher instead of your refund that you want, then that isn't protected under this scheme. So you are still liable to lose money if the airline goes bust, because it's not at all protected if you've booked a flight directly. Now, you will know if you've got a refund credit note because it should have an expiry date on it. It should have an information about your holiday with a booking reference number on it. And the amount it should be for should be the amount that you'd actually paid for the original holiday. So you need to make sure that if this is you and you accept it, that you're getting a refund credit note for a refund for your package holiday. Now, going forward, there's a lot of people who've got questions now that they're thinking, well, do I go away? If I'm thinking of going away. Now, if you suddenly have a cancelled trip going forward, you plan to go on holiday, you booked it and it was cancelled, and it was a package holiday, then you should get a refund within 14 days. Those are the rules. Yes, there are delays. You might have to bear with them, but you can get a refund. With a flight refund, it's a slightly different set of rules. If you've booked directly, then that will be a 7-day refund. Interestingly, if you book a hotel directly, so if you just book a hotel on its own, then there is no refund right in that instance. There's no scheme that is governed by it. You would be entitled to a refund, obviously, but it's governed by local law. So you're in the situation here that if you're listening to all what I've said so far, you're starting to see the attractiveness of package holidays, where some people in the past, I think the travel industry started to deviate from that. People started to book bits and pieces themselves because it was cheap if they did the flight here, the hotel here, and having something wrapped up in a package holiday. Because don't forget, you can go to independent travel agents who can pull a holiday together into a package. It doesn't mean a package holiday doesn't mean you have to go to TUI and pick one out of their catalogue. A package holiday can be done by an independent travel agent, and there are lots of them in the high street that will pull it all together into a package, which therefore means it is protected under ATOL, but it may be a little bit more expensive, but it will give you more security. So now let's imagine that you'd booked a trip and it wasn't cancelled, and for some reason there were reasons you didn't want to go because of the coronavirus outbreak. Then would you get your money back in those instances, because the holiday still exists but you don't want to go? Now, under a package holiday, there is a chance you could get money back within 14 days. And it's because of the wording of the rules around it that they give examples that you could be eligible for a refund if there's an outbreak of a disease in the destination you're going to. Now, if you imagine that your particular chosen destination, maybe the FCO suddenly changed the rules and said you shouldn't travel there, or because of a disease like coronavirus, then it could be argued that you might be able to get a refund. The thing is, you need to check with the travel operator to see what the situation is before you do anything. But there is a chance that you could do. Now, if you just booked flights and the flight goes, if you've just booked a flight on its own and they're going and you just haven't decided to get on the plane because of coronavirus or something like that, then you aren't entitled to a refund. It's going to be much more difficult. So the overriding message for future trips is don't cancel anything until you've checked what you're entitled to. Now, moving on to travel insurance. Now, there are few travel insurers that will pay out money because of coronavirus related issues. Now, there are some that if you go out there and you're sick, they'll pay for you to be treated. Some will pay for you to be repatriated, but it's unusual for any insurer to cover almost any coronavirus related claim. apparently there is a nationwide packaged account that offers travel insurance, which has the broadest coverage of coronavirus related claims on it. So that would be something for people to look at. Their website still talks about it. So have a look at that if you are interested, but it's part of a packaged account. So packaged accounts have always had bad press because often you can get a lot of the stuff packaged up. You could probably get it cheaper yourself or might not be using all the benefits. But this is an instance where a packaged account could potentially be good value. General rules of thumb seem to be that if you booked a holiday pre-coronavirus outbreak and had insurance that was pre that, then you're likely to be covered for coronavirus issues still. If your holiday was booked before coronavirus, but you renewed with the same company on an annual basis or whatever the policy when it renewed, then you are potentially likely to still be covered. So you have to check with your individual insurer. And of course, one final tip to bear in mind is to obviously use a credit card when you book a holiday. So under Section 75 of the Consumer Credit Act, you don't have to book for the whole value of the holiday as long as it's valued between £100 and £30,000, which most holidays will be, then your credit card company is equally liable for the product. So you don't have to pay for the full amount either of the holiday on your credit card. You can pay for just some of it and you'll be covered up to the full value of the holiday. So do bear that in mind because that gives you an extra level of protection, assuming that the airline, atoll, travel insurers all let you down. It's another level of protection. But you can see the message here is that package holidays are definitely becoming much more attractive than they were previously because of the protections they have. But you really have to think carefully if you want to book a holiday. You are opening yourself up to a lot of administrative and financial pain if things go wrong to try and get your money back. But it's buyer beware.
Okay, that moves us on to the last bit, and actually it ties in again with what we were talking about with the coronavirus. And these are some of the biggest scams that are going around at the moment. It's really just a sort of cautionary tale. These are the things that you need to be aware of. These are the things that people are getting caught out by. So shall I just reel them off? It's a quick list.
Reel them off, Andy, because I'm conscious of the time.
Okay, so the first one is one that's been doing the rounds for many years now. It's the fake government emails. We've probably all had them, to be honest. We've seen them before. It's generally a refund email. Click on the link and you'll get a tax rebate. And really all it's doing is a phishing email. It's asking for your personal information and just don't click on any links. Number 2 is scam emails offering access to COVID-19 relief funds. Essentially, if you do any of these things, you'll receive official title stuff from the government. And so don't click on any links through emails. Number 3, official looking emails offering council tax reductions. Again, if you think you're due council tax reductions, go onto your local council tax site and go through the official means. Anyone who received benefits, just be aware of any benefit offers that you're being received by text message or email. Again, go through your usual way that you would get your benefits through your bank account or through the reference numbers that you normally go through. There's a few health scams that are going around. So phishing emails that are claiming that you've been in contact with someone diagnosed with COVID. They lead to fake websites. Again, just be aware of any of those. Fake adverts for non-existent coronavirus related products such as hand sanitizers. I can't believe that all this sort of stuff is going on.
I was just thinking the same, Andy. I mean, I'm trying to keep the podcast clean. I'm almost, after each one, saying an explicit word. I can't believe some of them. I did hear one where people are getting phone calls pretending to be the track and trace team and saying that you may have been in touch and actually therefore wanting details from people and money. And of course, you ring up most people who know this system exists but don't really understand how it's working. Then you can see how they fall foul of it. I just think that scammers are just running rife at the moment. I think they're rubbing their hands because I think we're all in a world that's so uncertain, so different that we don't know what to expect. I mean, blimey, I've just talked about in this podcast that people are stuck in Spain. They were 1 minute they were going to Spain or thought they were going to stay there for 2 weeks. Next minute they're coming home. It's like a Russian roulette.
Yeah.
The world at the moment.
I'm smirking and smiling to what you were saying there because it's not that I find it funny. It's because I've got personal experience. My mum was talking to me just yesterday, said that she was randomly selected to take part in an antibody test and she'd filled in all the details online. She'd been sent a kit and she'd sent off blood. And I'm like, Mum, this is the most elaborate scam I've ever seen. Not only have they got all your bank details, they've got your DNA profile, but apparently it was all sort of absolutely fine. And she hasn't had coronavirus, by the way. And it's quite interesting. They're doing a random, I don't think she's been scammed. The final 3 scams just to look out for is to do with lockdown itself. And there are fake emails and texts claiming to be from TV licensing. Just, again, beware of clicking any links on anything that says that you need to fill in your details. Similarly, emails asking for you to update your card details on your subscription services. Go through your usual means, go through your account. If you've got Netflix, if you've got Prime, do it through the actual account itself, not through a random email that you've received. And finally, fake profiles on social media sites. They're being used to manipulate victims into handing over money. So criminals basically pretending that they're someone else and trying to get you to hand over your cash. So if you're being contacted on social media, check that the person who's contacting you is the person they say they are. I heard recently on a podcast that someone gave away their wallet for their Bitcoins because they believed it was someone who deals with Bitcoins, and they gave away all their passwords, and they've lost a lot of money through it. And that was through Instagram.
Yeah. So is that it? Because I feel like we've been shortchanged.
I've just realised, that was 9, not 10s. There is one. I just scammed you. The last one is beware of any fake investment opportunities. So again, we've seen a spike in Bitcoin platforms and things through social media asking you to invest in the fake promise that you can make thousands and thousands. Just beware.
Yeah, one of the big things I think is encouraging some of this is the speculation we're seeing in stock markets. Now, on midweek markets have been talking quite a bit lately about the speculation we're seeing in America with Robinhood traders. We're seeing bits of it over here too, but where people are starting to bet on companies, particularly companies who are trying to make coronavirus treatments and vaccines, because we're seeing their share prices be incredibly volatile that will leap 10-20% in a day only to fall again when the news or the realities catch up with the news. So we're seeing a lot of people who are making quick money by backing unloved shares, airline stocks that have fallen. So there's a lot of people out there who are perhaps cash rich, because as much as it sounds odd, there is a disparity. There are people who are struggling during this period, but there are people who've maintained their jobs, kept their jobs, who are actually better off in this period because of the government support schemes that have kept everything sort of afloat for now. So those people are actually susceptible to these scams because they're thinking about how they're going to make a bit more money with the extra cash they've got.
So that's it. We're done. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien@moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's @moneytothemasses with the number 2. Please do get your reviews in. As we said, we're going to read out a bumper list of reviews next week. So if you want to get your name and your review read out on the podcast, head over to Apple Podcasts and submit your review. We'd really appreciate that. Of course, don't forget, we've got the Facebook group. There's lots and lots of activity. In fact, just in the last couple of hours, we've had a flurry, maybe 10 or so questions in there. So if you want to get involved, we'd love to see you in there. It's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses.
And before we finish, Andy, just to give people a little bit of a teaser, we're going to hit a particular milestone on the podcast in the next week. We'll tell you more about what that is next time. So until next week.
What a teaser. Until next week.